advocate with the Natural Resources Defense Council. JC is going to be leading us through our panelists tonight and doing some facilitation. I'll hand it over to you, JC.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Really excited to be here with y'all. As Amanda said, I'm JC Kibbe. I'm the Illinois Clean Energy Advocate with Natural Resources Defense Council. I live in Chicago, and we're going to be talking a lot tonight about the Prairie State coal plant, as well as a little bit about the Clean Energy Jobs Act. Moving away from Prairie State coal plant and coal across our state is important for our climate, our health, and part of what we're proposing to do in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. This issue is also very important to me on a personal level. My great-grandfather mined coal in West Virginia. My grandfather sold rail cars that shipped coal from Wyoming. And my dad did economic development work in communities in Kentucky that had been devastated by the decline of coal. I grew up in a community that had a municipal utility, like many of you here tonight, and that operated coal plants. And I drove by one of them on my way to school every day. So thinking about the kids just like me in Illinois who see those coal plants every day, who breathe that dirty air every day, and who deserve a just transition for their communities, that's really important to me. So what is CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act? It's comprehensive energy legislation that would move Illinois to 100% clean energy, that would clean up our electric sector, our transportation, our buildings, that would transform our economy and pivot it towards clean energy in a way that is going to create good jobs, and that would provide a just transition for the people, communities, and workers that are impacted by the ongoing decline of coal. It does that in a way that centers equity at every step of the way. This is a bill that was the furthest thing from developed in the smoky back room that Illinois has unfortunately become known for. This was developed with dozens of meetings in every corner of this state, from Waukegan to Cairo. And we asked the people what they wanted in their clean energy future, and that's within this bill. And lastly, it would support a more modern electric grid. It would hold utilities accountable, and it would have a more transparent and democratic process as far as the way that we plan our electric grid. And one part of cleaning up our state's power sector is transitioning away from coal, including the Prairie State coal plant. A bit about it: it's the largest coal plant in Illinois and one of the largest in the country. It was built a little over a decade ago at a cost of about $5 billion. Today, dozens of communities across Illinois are trapped in long-term contracts, paying not only the $5 billion that it costs to build this plant, but they're forced to buy pricey energy that, as you'll see tonight, is not a good deal. So we're going to talk a bit tonight about what Prairie State means for our health and for our climate, as well as what it means for our electric bills and our wallets, and what are our options for a just transition away from this plant, and how can CEJA help support that just transition. So you'll be hearing from a lot of folks tonight, some of them technical experts, but perhaps most importantly, leaders in communities that are impacted by this plant. And so without further ado, I will hand the mic off to a stellar leader, Jean Cordy of Highland, who's going to give us some history on the plant and a bit about the contracts that I mentioned that many of our communities are locked into. So thanks for being here, Jean, and take it away.
Thank you, JC. Let's see here. Hi, so from my days in finance and accounting, I like digging into business relationships. As I dug into my community's electricity provider, I was frustrated by what I found. Then I found people in over 250 communities like Highland will spend the next 15 to 25 years paying for a coal plant that is uneconomic and bad for them. Next, please. Over 90% of my city's electricity comes from coal, the red and the blue pieces of the pie chart. We are joined with 31 other Illinois communities in a 15% ownership of Prairie State Generating Company. There are over 250 communities locked into these ownership contracts. 90% of, next slide, please. 90% of Illinois citizens get their electric supply from Ameren or ComEd, but the munis and co-ops like my town have a long tradition of managing their own power. As not-for-profits, they expected to keep the rates low. Munis and co-ops were not required to participate in the deregulation of the electricity providers in the 90s. Into the 2000s, our communities grew and saw that they were going to need more power. That's when over 250 communities were sold a long-term investment in Prairie State Energy Company. Next. Peabody Energy developed the project that we now know as Prairie State Energy Campus. But before the project was even complete, Peabody saw that coal would not be a good long-term investment. Let me repeat that. Peabody Energy, an industry insider, decided not to invest in a new coal plant. In the mid-2000s, Peabody sold the project for over $5 billion in debt, along with all the investment risk to our communities. Town council members who voted and mayors who signed on the dotted line, their day job wasn't in the power industry. These were people from all walks of life serving their small towns out of the goodness of their hearts. And they were sold a deal that would be uneconomic before even half the debt was paid for. Next, please. The 9 agency owners of Prairie State started delivering electricity in 2012 at prices well above market rates. The agencies outlined in green serve Illinois customers. Today, cheaper, cleaner energy technology is available, but muni co-op communities can't invest in the changing market. Next, please. The writing is on the wall. Prairie State coal is the most expensive power available. Depending on the contract, there's still 15 to 25 years to pay on the debt. We are all underwater. We continue to pay for harmful, uneconomic assets. Future payments would be much better spent if we could put them toward new technology. Next. For example, schools are perfect solar customers. They use the most energy during the day. The long-term contracts that were sold to us severely limit self-generation. They don't allow power purchase agreements, and they are not serving the best interests of our communities. Being locked into coal takes money away from education, and that's not good. Next slide. The 9 owners of Prairie State, represented by the different colors on the map, secured the $5 billion in debt with our electric revenues, the muni co-op citizens across 7 states. Owners have different debt maturities. They aren't likely to agree on a closing date for Prairie State. The best case is for the federal or Illinois state government to choose a closing date for them. With the decarbonization pillar of the Clean Energy Jobs Act, we have an opportunity for Prairie State owners to proactively be part of the transition to better technology. The owners are uniquely positioned to help communities innovate and meet clean energy goals. Next. With subsidies in their pockets and a monopoly on our electric supply, the owners of Prairie State Energy aren't motivated to work toward what is best and cheapest for our communities. Our power portfolio should include more self-generation and the ability to use power purchase agreements for self-generation projects like schools. Let's stop funding lobbyists that stall the transition to renewable energy. Let's advocate planning for the renewable energy future and support the Clean Energy Jobs Act that sets a closing date for Prairie State and supports the people of communities that are affected by coal mine closure, a just transition. Let's help munis and co-ops participate in cleaner, cheaper energy. Next. As member owners of Prairie State, it's time to use our voices to make change in our future. Here's a summary of the ideas I discussed. Please contact your Illinois legislator to set a closing date for Prairie State, because we can't afford not to. There are solutions. Let's keep the conversation going.
Thanks so much, Jean. Really appreciate you sharing a bit about that background with us. Next, we will hear from Ashton Massey. She's an energy analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists and a lead author on the recent Contracts to Burn report, which looked at long-term fossil fuel energy contracts, including Prairie State. Thanks for being with us, Ashton.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm gonna start my slides. Can you guys see these okay?
Yep.
Awesome. So hi, everybody. I'm Ashton. I'm an energy analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm here to talk about a recent paper that we released in December, where we tried to analyze the question, how do long-term contracts keep fossil fuels on the grid? So one of the ways that, or one of the types of contracts that can keep fossil fuels on the grid is a power purchase agreement. It's a contractual agreement between two parties to buy and sell power. Now, not all power purchase agreements are bad, right? Jean just mentioned that when schools have power purchase agreements to buy solar, right? That those are good contracts, as well as short-term contracts can be good as well. But it's these long-term contracts for fossil fuel drive power that can harm our communities. That they can lock in costs and emissions for years to come when cheaper and cleaner resources are available or could become available during the length of the contract. So we released an analysis called Contracts to Burn in December. Through this analysis, we tried to see how many contracts for fossil fuels exist in the US currently. We wanted to see how much power those contracts are for, and how long those contracts last, and how much estimated pollution is contractually obligated to be produced as a result of these contracts. So these are our primary results from that analysis. This is a nationwide look at the existing contracts for fossil fuel power in the US. So there are a few key takeaways that we found. First, we found that most of the existing contracts for fossil fuels are with coal-fired power plants. And we found that most of the contracts end by about the mid-2020s. Unfortunately, as you all know, that's not the case for Prairie State. And Prairie State has longer contracts beyond the mid-2020s and that latter half of the graph that are creating emissions for our communities for the next 10 to 20 to however years until that plant eventually shuts down. So when we broke that down further and looked, when we analyzed existing contracts at plants across the US, then when we looked plant by plant to see who are sort of those worst actors that have the longest and most polluting contracts, we found that Prairie State was the top of the list. And because of the contracts at Prairie State produced the most CO2 and SO2 emissions of any other fossil fuel contract in the US. So Prairie State has some bad contracts associated with it, right? Those long-term contracts are polluting our communities and keeping people on the line to pay for them, which is why we want to get this shut down, obviously. Let me go to the next slide. When we look at power plants specifically in Illinois, right, that big red shading represents Prairie State, and all the other colors represent the other fossil fuel plants in Illinois that have contracts. So this doesn't seem to be as big of a problem for any other power plant in Illinois except for Prairie State. Unfortunately, right, many of the power plants with the highest emissions from fossil fuels serve co-ops and municipalities. So that sort of complexity makes it more difficult for us to tackle this issue. But with coordinated efforts, we can try to move past these restrictive contracts. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Ashton. Really helpful. And someone in the chat had just asked where they could take a look at the full report that Ashton was just referencing, that Contracts to Burn report. And Megan has put that in the chat. So anybody who's interested in that, please feel free to click through there and take a look. Next up, we have Pastor Kevin James. He's a pastor of the Macedonia Baptist Church, and he's vice president of the board of United Congregations of Metro East. Pastor, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, JC, and to everyone. It's an honor to be here and to share. Tonight, this conversation around environment and climate change is important to me and the community I have the pleasure of serving, as we know all too well the impacts of plants. Many of the residents, inclusive of my members, live within miles of the Veolia Environmental Services incinerator in Sauget, Illinois. It has caused concern to many residents as the smells and the health effects thereafter are great, ranging from headaches to even the development of asthma. Community is the backbone of any city, state, and our country as a whole. And while we know that there are arguments regarding the jobs connected to these plants and the many lives that would be impacted by any reimagining, we must think about the grave impact that these plants pose to the health of our community as a whole. Research has shown that pollutants from Prairie State do nearly $2 billion in damage to our health and environment each year. I hope you guys heard that. $2 billion in damage to our health and environment each year, with 49 deaths per year, deaths that could be avoided. If it is our desire to create a more just and equitable country, then it must work in tandem with clean energy. We owe it to the residents of this state and the future of our state to not only have these conversations, but put realistic steps in place to become more effective. As a pastor and community leader, I want to see a cleaner and safer Illinois, a place where our children, our seniors, our families, and communities as a whole can live and enjoy a healthy life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pastor. So we've heard from several folks, and we've talked a bit about how Prairie State is bad for our climate. It's the largest contributor to climate change in our state and one of the 10 biggest contributors to climate change in the United States. If we're serious about a livable climate future, that future can't include Prairie State and big coal plants like it. We've talked about how Prairie State is bad for our health. We heard from Pastor James how its toxic pollution does more than $2 billion in damage each year, and how its pollution kills one person nearly each week. We've heard that Illinois is transitioning away from coal quickly, but the unique binding contracts that many communities are locked into are keeping Prairie State online beyond what we're seeing in the rest of the coal fleet. So we're going to pivot in just a moment to talking more specifically about the economics of this plant. But as we're doing that, we have to remember that when we're thinking about cost, the numbers on our accounting spreadsheets are not the whole picture when it comes to cost. This plant costs us a livable climate. It costs us our health. It costs us an opportunity for good, clean energy jobs, like the two fastest growing jobs in our country, wind turbine technician and solar panel installer, that are going to other states instead of here. And it costs us lives. So with that, I want to turn to Kevin Brem. Kevin is a manager in the carbon-free electricity program at RMI. He has worked with communities and utilities across the country to accelerate a transition to a just, clean energy future. And he's the lead author of the recent report, Transition Opportunities for the Prairie State Energy Campus, which we will hear about tonight. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, JC. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to join this conversation today. I'm Kevin. I'm calling in from Carbondale, Colorado. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. If you're not familiar with RMI, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that works to transform global energy systems. In that work, as part of our electricity program, my day-to-day is spent working with electric utilities, with regulators, and with communities and community members like yourselves to figure out and implement ways to transform our energy systems so they can remain reliable and affordable, as they have done a pretty good job of doing in our lifetimes, and transition to being more equitable and clean. In considering closing down Prairie State, I think it's pretty easy to see that closing the plant down would help move towards a more equitable and clean power system, one that would have health impacts. But the question remained, what would that do for the affordability of power? What would that do for reliability? So we were brought in to conduct an analysis to understand just that, to address some claims that if Prairie State were mandated to be closed, that there would be a huge increase in the cost of power, and that would be untenable, unacceptable for the communities impacted. Our analysis has shown that that is not the case. And our analysis, I'll show, is that, in fact, there's opportunities to embrace this transition and for the owner communities to not resist, but embrace the opportunity to transition to a better, cleaner, lower cost power supply. I'm going to start by sharing a couple slides with you. And most of these are charts from the report. So I think to set the broad context for this, coal is in decline. US coal consumption is lower than it's been in over a century. Yes, a century. I think this is kind of striking. First, I'll talk about the chart and some of what this means. So if you look at this chart, this is coal consumption, tons of coal consumed. In 2020, you saw a big drop. That was driven in part by COVID and the change in the energy consumption. I will recognize that we might see that number go up a little bit over time. The other thing I'd point is if you look at the early part of the 20th century, you saw there's sort of an increase and then a fall. In the early part of the 20th century, a lot of our coal was actually used for burning to heat homes and to drive industry, steel, et cetera. Regardless, I think what we're seeing here is a couple things that's important. Number one is clear coal was a key driver of the 20th century. It was interesting to hear JC's remarks because like JC, my great-grandfather worked in the coal industry up in Northeast Pennsylvania. And, you know, I currently live in Carbondale, Colorado, a community that was largely built for and by coal miners until those coal mines shut down in the 1980s and 1990s. And I know there's a lot of communities that have similar stories to that. But if you look at this chart, you see a dramatic decline in the amount of coal consumed over time so that we're achieving historic lows. You know, I think a couple of implications for this is if you are currently in a community that owns coal, you should be thinking, what does this mean for my community? What happens if this trend continues? Do I want to be the one left holding the bag? I think the second thing worth considering as you look at this, actually, the other thing that's worth mentioning is why do we see this trend happening? You know, and there's a few reasons that this is happening. One is we are seeing restrictions, regulations put in place a little bit, recognizing that coal has significant negative impacts on health and the planet. So in the past couple decades, controls have been put in place to make sure that we're scrubbing the emissions coming from those coal plants. Some coal plants have shut down as a result. The other one is economics. Coal is the fuel of the 20th century for our power system. It does not look like it's going to be the fuel of the 21st century, and the data shows that. So to double click on that, you know, I think as Pastor James mentioned, the health and the emissions impacts are huge and staggering. Prairie State is a major emitter of greenhouse gas and health impacting SOx and NOx, so sulfur oxides and nitrous oxides. Not only is it a major emitter, it is by far the largest emitter of those gases in the state of Illinois. Prairie State generates more emissions than any other Illinois power plant. Compared to the second most polluting plants in 2019, Prairie State produced 105% more carbon dioxide, 3% more nitrous oxides, and 46% more sulfur oxides. One thing that was striking and surprising as we did this analysis is Prairie State was built as this clean coal plant, a new technology. You know, so part of the reason the emissions are so high is because it produces a lot more energy than other power plants. But then if you actually break it down, this chart at the right looks emissions per unit energy generated, per megawatt hour generated. And it turns out compared to other coal plants that may have been around since the 60s or 70s, it in fact is no better. It's no more efficient at creating energy with less carbon dioxide. And in fact, it's much worse. So it's clear, and this is the motivation or one of the main motivators of the CEJA legislation, that this has a huge impact on the environment and on the population. So again, circling back to this question, well, can the communities still expect to have low cost, reliable, affordable energy if the plant is closed down? So I'm going to talk to both sides of this chart briefly, and sort of the headline here is Prairie State is barely profitable compared with the market now, depending on how you look at the economics, and it's unlikely to save money compared with the market in the future. So first, starting on the left side, as some context, in Illinois, MISO and PJM are the energy markets that ensure reliability, and they administer energy and capacity markets. Okay, what does this mean? I think one thing that's important for communities to recognize is, first of all, you and all other communities want to ensure that you have reliable power. When you turn on the lights, you'll have that power. Oftentimes, we think about the folks who we're paying our bills to are the ones responsible for that. That's only partly true. It's only partly true. In Illinois, it's actually MISO and PJM that are responsible for ensuring that as a whole, there's enough capacity available at any time to ensure the lights stay on when you flick that switch. What's one of the implications there? I think just to make it clear, if your community currently depends on Prairie State, if Prairie State is unavailable, if it has a mechanical failure, you do not lose your lights. If CEJA were to require the Prairie State to be closed, that would have the same impact. And this has sort of a couple implications. So I think that's the one thing to recognize, that as we think about solutions and think about how we can have clean energy solutions, we rely not just on the utility, individual utility, but on the broader market. I think the other point that I want to emphasize here is that there are these energy markets within which these utilities operate. That is one way that we can think about what's the alternative of buying power energy from this one power source. So using that data, we were able to do some economic analysis. So if you look at this chart on the right, I'll talk through this briefly and explain how we used it. So we used market data to evaluate the current economics of Prairie State. So first I'm going to start on the left, and this is the cost of Prairie State. So to operate Prairie State, you have to pay for the fuel that comes from the adjacent coal mine. That's basically the cost to mine it. You have to pay for operations and maintenance of the plant. You have to pay for capital additions. These are sort of new equipment, machinery that you would add every few years. Also, and really importantly, you have to pay for the immense debt that was taken out to pay for this plant. That interest and principal is staggering. Now, what could you compare that to? You can compare it to the cost to buy energy from the market, or you could compare it to the cost to buy new capacity, is what we put here. The report gets into some of the nuances of how you would do the economics. That's sort of a conservative way of looking at the cost of capacity. And just to sort of show how we take this from here, these costs at the bottom could be avoided if the plant were closed. The costs at the top are mostly fixed. I say mostly. Our report looks at ways that these costs could be avoided. There's a robust conversation that could be had about ways to do that. But most of our analysis just focused on that bottom stack and said, okay, can we avoid those costs by shutting down this plant? Our conclusions, again, the report gets a little bit into it. So even thinking about that interest and principal as being fixed, if you look at the current cost to operate the plant, it's more or less break even compared to the market, depending on how you cut it. Now, what do we expect to happen in the future? I'll show you what our analysis shows, but I think intuitively, this is what you'd expect to happen. Nobody's betting on coal. Even if Illinois doesn't pass CEJA, we're expecting the federal government and others to continue to find ways to put prices that account for the whole cost of coal. On the other hand, and at the same time, we're seeing wind, solar, and other technologies advance. So those technologies are rapidly declining. So if the economics aren't great now, as this technology develops, there's no reason to believe that they'll get better in the future. And that's what our analysis showed. Given recent and projected declines in the cost of renewable energy and battery storage, Prairie State's go-forward costs will likely be significantly more expensive than alternatives prior to 2030, meaning that customers will save money when Prairie State stops operating. I'll speak to this relatively high level and sort of with 2 points. So one is, you can see here, there is expected to continue to be a significant decline in the cost of solar and wind. Renewable energy is becoming much cheaper and becoming cheaper now to build, own, and operate clean energy than the cost to just operate Prairie State and other coal plants. That's a remarkable change that's happened over time. But as I mentioned before, and it's fairly clear, wind and solar aren't available all the time. So we need to think about ways that we can have a power system that can rely on clean energy, but also make sure that we have the capacity, the ability to deliver power all the time. We took one approach to looking at this, which we call a CEP, or Clean Energy Plan. A clean energy plan is a set of resources that includes wind, solar. It also includes local community resources, including energy efficiency, demand response, and battery storage. So I think, as I've laid out, and our report also suggests, closing Prairie State by 2030, as C just suggested, is unlikely to cause rates to go way up. Now, this isn't something we got into the report, but just to take a step back and consider a hypothetical. What if CEJA weren't closed? What would happen? I think there's basically two paths that I think would be most likely. One is the plant would be retired within a number of years regardless. Think of that trend in that chart I started with, as we see coal not just slowly declining, but collapsing. If it's not CEJA, perhaps it's President Biden's plan to have a 100% clean power sector by 2035. Perhaps it's just market economics and what we see from coal plants all over the place. The other scenario is actually a little bit more of a dreary scenario. The other scenario is this plant continues to putter along for years and years. Some years, maybe it makes a little bit of money. Some years, maybe it loses some money. Regardless, your communities remain bound to this coal plant. As a result, you're unable to invest in the solar on schools like Jean suggested. You're unable to embrace alternatives like, how can we weatherize and find energy efficiency opportunities to make our homes more comfortable and livable? How can we invest in our communities as part of the solution? And I think with that, I think that's sort of consistent with one of our findings. Overall, that closing this plant is an opportunity to catalyze a better energy future for Illinois and for your communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for going deep with us on why the not only our health, not only our climate, but also the economics increasingly point us towards clean energy. So next we have Stephen Tarver of Cairo. Stephen is the president of Men of Power, Women of Strength. And we heard from Kevin about the numbers on what this plan does to our air and what it costs. And Stephen is going to share a more personal perspective on some of that. So thanks so much for being with us tonight, Steve.
Good evening, everyone. Everybody loves a great story. Once upon a time, there was a young, handsome young lad, and his name just happened to be Stephen, by the way, who grew up in a little small town called Cairo, Illinois. And this lad remembers right around the age of 9 or 10 years old, going from door to door and neighbor to neighbor, bartering stuff from each other in a community that was thriving and growing. This happened to be at a time right after racial tension and a lot of things that took place that caused businesses to decline. Leaders and businesses and owners, they decided to pack up and move out, and the city started to deteriorate. But it didn't take away the love and the compassion that each and every person had for their city, and it just continued to grow and grow. Well, that young lad, as we move forward, unfortunately, his parents decided to get a divorce, and he left the city of Cairo to go and move on to other things. As time passes, this young lad returned back to Cairo, Illinois. And he came back to an area that he saw that the businesses not only had declined and left, but also now there seemed to be a housing crisis. This housing crisis was dealing with the government housing, which allowed the citizens to live under extreme conditions for numerous years without any checking, without any checks and balances. And now it came to a head where it's time to come and correct the problem. But this young lad said, man, there's gotta be something that can save this beautiful land. Cairo used to be so wonderful with all the big stores and all the wonderful stories that were told. So then this lad and his brother sat and came up with an organization called Men of Power and Women of Strength. This organization was designed to help try to understand what was going on with the housing prices and try to get people to be able to stay in the land and their home that they love so much. Unfortunately, that task was completed when they decided to tear down those housing projects, and over 40 families, over 400 different members of families were relocated to different areas outside of Cairo. They may even stay in places near you. I think this is where you would put in the music, the sad music. But right after you hear that in a story, it usually changes and things get better. So now we have Men of Power, Women in Strength. We have an organization that is determined not to give up, to what I like to call stay in the fight. We have people that are embedded in a town that really wants to see it grow. So therefore, they're not counting that there hasn't been any new housing built in over 50 years. They're not counting that there's no grocery store or gas station or anything of some of the necessities that are needed in our town. They're not even counting that most of the dollars and resources that are available for this great state of Illinois doesn't trickle down to Exit 1. No, these people are concentrating on a restoration of a city that they love so much. But there seems to be a problem. And you guys have heard a lot of it talking about the coal and how it affects the atmosphere and the environment. But I want to tell you what's holding up the city of Cairo right now. When I did research when I got back to the town, and I started wondering why and what happened, and with all the available space and all the available resources that's available in the state, and with all of the ideals, I mean, if you could think of anything that's needed, it's needed here. And with all the great creative people and all the people that will come together, what is stopping the advancement? And then I heard of a place or an organization called IMEA, the Illinois Municipal Electric Agency. What does that mean for us? It's a nonprofit group, just like Men of Power, Women of Strength. But our mission statement is to better the community. And I sometimes question if that mission statement is meeting. I read their mission statement, and it also said in their terms to better communities also. But let me tell you how it affects Cairo, Illinois. Our public utility company is Cairo Public Utility, which is also nonprofit, signed a contract with IMEA in 1995, a 30-year contract. So from 1995 up into, we have about 4 years left on this beautiful deal. We have been limited on where we can get our energy, how we can get our energy, how fast we can move toward the legislating and toward the solar movement and to other avenues that's going to lessen the cost for businesses and residents in our town. For instance, when I first moved back, my rent was $250 a month, but my average electrical cost was $400 to $500 a month. We're talking about one person in a one bedroom. Imagine families. So therefore, as I in this story, I realized that you can't operate in a town so small that has been depleted of so many resources and so much of its population has moved under such tight, strict regulations that are brought on by IMEA. We are at a point now that we're at our dying point. Sure, we have a great announcement of a port coming here soon, but what happens in the time frame from when the port comes to now? We have many people that are striking business plans, and they're reaching out to resources all over the state. But it all comes back to, can we afford to start a business? Another example I would like to give you real fast is we were just happened to open a business here. It's called Tacos to Go. Tacos to Go has operated for maybe 2 full months, but I understand that it's closed now because of the electrical rates. Unfortunately, they were allowed to use solar on their building. But I'm not sure about the contract, but I understand that they're not allowed to use a majority of what they create. So they're still paying a great amount of their profits back into electricity. That is the crippling effect that we're having in our small town right now. And I'm not sure how it's affecting you guys, but over a period of years, remember, I said 1995. Here we are, 2021. And this young lad was able to see a declining city done in by racism, done in by bad political and leadership moves, but now by an electrical company or electrical nonprofit company who has 15% of the ownership of your Prairie State coal mine. So they're not hurting for anything. My question would be, when will they take the grips off of those small communities that are still thriving, that still have hope and still want to restore so that we can have a happy ending? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Stephen. I hope that with our work here tonight and with all the folks that we have on the call, we can work together to write a good ending to that story. So I want to just summarize a bit what we've heard tonight one more time. We know that Prairie State hurts our climate, one of the worst contributors to climate change in the United States. We know that it makes our air dirty. We know that it makes our people sick. And we know from RMI's report that our wallets, that our communities, that our finances would be better financially if we close this plant down. And we heard from Stephen that we need to move towards an energy system that enables economic opportunity for everybody, and not one that just allows a few people at the top to profit while the rest of us breathe, toxic air and are shut out from the economic opportunities that our communities in Illinois need so badly. And so how do we get from here to there? Well, there's no silver bullet, but the biggest and most exciting opportunity that we have in front of us today to move in the direction that we need to go, to move towards clean energy, to move away from Prairie State, to move towards lower energy costs and cleaner air, is the Clean Energy Jobs Act. That is the best opportunity that we have right now to shut this plant down and move to something better. So how do we get there? I want to go to Q&A in just one second, but this is so important because you all on this call right now have the power to move us in the right direction on this plant. Everybody who talked tonight, we can't do it on our own. We are few and you are many. So how do we get there? How can you help? A lot of folks in the chat asked about that, and it's so exciting to see that people are chomping at the bit to get involved. We need to pass the Clean Energy Jobs Act. Please call your legislator. We still have a lot of legislators who still aren't supporting the Clean Energy Jobs Act. It has more support from more legislators than any other energy legislation out there, but we need 60 in the House and 30 in the Senate if we want that thing to pass and the governor's signature on it when it's all done. So call your state representative, call your state senator, call the governor and tell them that you want the Clean Energy Jobs Act, that you want clean energy for your community and not the dirty coal from Prairie State if you live in the Prairie State community. And especially if you do live in a Prairie State community, call your local officials too, because they're not the ones voting on the Clean Energy Jobs Act, but believe it or not, your state legislators listen to what they have to say about this. And if the local officials are just saying, oh yeah, the Prairie State's plant's great, we want to keep it running for the next 20 years, that's not going to help. So they've got to hear from their constituents that you want a clean energy future, that you want something better. So please call them as well. And I know that our contact information will be available. I know myself and others, if you want to get even more involved than that, but that is the great opportunity that we've got in front of us right now. So with that, I know we've got a lot of great questions that we've gotten in the chat and that folks submitted beforehand. So I think I will kick it over to Amanda, and we can start answering some of those for you all.
Great, thank you, JC, and thank you to all the panelists tonight and to the participants who've already been asking great questions. You'll notice there's a chat and there's also a Q&A function. We're monitoring both for questions, so you can put those in there. Myself and Sally Burgess with Illinois Sierra Club are gonna take turns pitching questions to the panelists. So I think I'm gonna start with one here that may have been addressed, but I'm gonna go ahead and give it to Kevin and ask, when do the contracts run through? And does the structure of this power plant mean that they do not sell electricity into MISO or PJM? And I guess probably Kevin or JC.
I'm actually, you know, there's so many communities involved, so it depends in part on the communities. I'm gonna punt maybe to JC, and I think Jean has some insight as well on that one.
Yeah, I think it does vary a lot from community to community. I believe some of the earliest contracts that are up in the early 2040s. I think that's the case for many of the communities in Illinois, and I think that some run even longer than that. I see someone in the chat is referencing a community in Ohio that they're saying is contracted until 2062. Just a quick reminder to folks that what the best science tells us about climate change is that we have to cut our emissions worldwide in half by 2030. And that means that rich countries like the United States and forward-thinking states like Illinois probably have to do even more than that. And that we have to have our emissions at net zero, or really probably even negative, by 2050. And that is going to be so hard to achieve, even if everything goes right. And so to have terrible polluting coal plants like this on operating for decades, we just can't afford that if we want to preserve a livable climate. So we can follow up with some more detailed numbers on some of those communities. If whomever asked that question can share their contact information, we do have all that in the spreadsheet. But again, it varies a lot. But the bigger point here is that many of these communities are on the hook for decades, and we just can't do that. So thanks.
Thank you, JC. And someone from Ohio in the chat shared that they're on the hook until 2062. So there's definitely a lot of variation there. And Sally, I'll go ahead and let you ask the next question.
I'm going to go to the question from Gary, which he also put in the chat. Illinois urged state lawmakers today to accelerate the state's transition to 100% clean energy. Question, does clean energy equal nuclear or gas with carbon capture?
I can field that. So Gary, there's two timelines in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. The first timeline, which is where we ultimately want to go, is 100% renewable energy by 2050. So renewable energy means wind, solar. It does not include nuclear. It does not include fossil fuels of any kind, including with carbon capture and sequestration. That's where we know we need to get. The quicker deadline in CEJA is 2030, and that's a carbon-free electric sector by 2030. So that means no more gas or coal. It could include nuclear. And the reason is that we heard when we had all those meetings all over the state that I referenced at the beginning, what we heard loud and clear is that people wanted the fossil fuel plants in their communities closed, and that was the priority. And we know how nasty the health impacts of gas and coal are. And so long term, we know that we have to move towards 100% renewable energy, but we also know that the first thing we need to move away from is these fossil fuel plants. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, JC. There was a question in the Q&A that I've already answered, but I'm going to go ahead and just call it out. Somebody asked what Prairie State currently does with their coal ash. As many of you might know, Prairie Rivers Network, my colleague Andrew is kind of the Illinois coal ash guru. So I did want to share that this is not something, this is an environmental impact that we did not even cover on tonight's town hall. Prairie State's unique in that instead of a coal ash pond, they actually have a coal ash landfill It's a 750 acre landfill, and they're making more coal ash each year than the amount stored at most facilities over their entire multi-decade operating life. So I put this answer in the Q&A. I'll also put it in the chat here. There's a report called Cap and Run that you can check out on page 38. It dives into the groundwater violations that are occurring at Prairie State. And then I will go ahead and hand it back to Sally.
Thank you, Amanda. A question in the Q&A. Is there a place where I can see the sources my energy co-op buys their power from and the percentage from each source? Anybody have thoughts about that?
I've looked for that. You go.
Well, I can go where I might look, but I think it depends on who your co-op is and how open they are. So, I mean, I think the general principle for cooperatives and municipal utilities is they're subject to the communities, and as such, being democratic entities, it would make sense that they would be forthcoming about information. That is sometimes the case, but that's not always the case. If I were to look for that information, I would look at if it's a co-op, it's usually served by a GNT. Sometimes on their websites, the GNTs, they have information about the totality of their power supply, and some are very transparent and good about that. I'd also look at the annual reports. Oftentimes the GNTs put out an annual report. So that's kind of generic, but again, it's going to depend on your utility. It sounds like, Jean, you've got some specific insights from your investigations.
I was mainly going to say that it's very opaque. The annual report for the IMEA does tell us what percentage of the sources of fuel, but even when I asked to see specific contracts and they claimed there was confidentiality attached to them, and they were not forthcoming.
I also think that if you're not able to get that information from the reports that they put out, and there's a body that ostensibly is a part of a government that democratically represents you, I would encourage you to just give that utility a call and ask them where they can get that, where you can get that information. And if they can't tell you, maybe ask them why not.
Thank you. So we're going to pause the Q&A for a moment. We're joined tonight by Senator Ellman, and we were just going to give her a moment to say a few words. I know we have some questions about the status of CEJA and where it is in the legislature, and our representatives like Senator Ellman are the ones that are leading that effort. So go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Amanda. Hi, everybody. Just a quick note on the state of the legislation. I'm vice chair of the Energy and Public Utilities Committee in the Senate, in the Illinois Senate. And we've had a lot of subject matter hearings, but we really haven't had too many votes on the major legislation. So it's going to be coming up, you know, through May. So please contact your legislators. If you are in support of CEJA, we all listen to our constituents. So please do reach out. On the topic of Prairie State, I live in Naperville, and Naperville is a member of IMEA, which is a partial owner of Prairie State. And I'm really concerned about when Prairie State does close, that our municipalities and actually the citizens and the ratepayers of these municipalities will be left holding the bag of debt. I know that the RMI report did talk a little bit about how that could possibly be softened, maybe through, I think the term was securitization. And if I can ask a question during my little time here, could you give a little bit of a description of what that could be and how much that might be able to, like what kind of percentage that could possibly save ratepayers who are still whose contracts will last a long time?
Sure. Yeah, I can address that. It's a challenge. There's not an easy answer. So I'm not going to pretend that securitization is the answer and makes it go away. I'll explain how securitization works and how it can help address the problem at least a little bit. And perhaps through 1,000 cuts, we can find a way to sort of really diminish this as a problem and really solve this problem. So securitization is essentially a way to refinance that outstanding debt. So it's analogous to if you're paying, if you've got a mortgage or a car payment, refinancing it at a lower rate. Whereas normally when you would go about and refinance, it would be based upon the banks, the folks who are issuing the debt would say, well, how likely do I think it is that IMEA is going to pay back this debt? And looking at all the municipalities. It's a special structure where it guarantees through the Public Utility Commission's intervention that this would be paid back through rates over time. And usually the folks who are supporting or sort of evaluating how much they should, what sort of interest rates they should provide through debt, look at that and say, okay, well, given that, then that, there's a structure that is going to say it's going to be paid back from ratepayers over time. There's the opportunity to get lower rates. So we looked at that in the report. It's, I would say, significant, but not huge. It's, again, one of the many cuts which can help address this, along with some of the other measures that are included in CEJA legislation.
Thank you, Senator Ellman and Kevin. Any other thoughts on that, or we can move on to our next question?
Ready for the next question? Did
so.
You have one, Amanda?
I do see a question here about if CEJA moves forward, do legislatures in states outside of Illinois that purchase energy from Prairie State have any legal input if there is a threat that Prairie State closes? So basically, we saw that ownership map that Jean put up and saw ownership across the Midwest. So how does this affect other states?
I think I can field that. We've had several lawyers look at this question. And because Prairie State is located in the state of Illinois, and under the Clean Air Act, the state of Illinois retains the right to regulate air pollutants, which includes carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxides, other pollutants that Prairie State emits. They're allowed to regulate those up to and including the closure of facilities that emit them. So we see the state of Illinois as being well within its rights to regulate emissions at that plant up to and including closure.
Thank you, JC.
Amanda, if I may, there's a couple questions in here that are kind of on the same theme, and I just maybe before we wrap up tonight, I can just address a couple of those quickly. Folks are asking, what is this going to mean for the transition? What is this going to mean for the community? How can we have the companies that are responsible for climate and for health damage pay for that? And that's one of the things that we took really seriously in CEJA is a just transition. And so through two fees, which are based on the idea of polluters paying. One is a coal severance fee, which virtually every other coal extracting state already has. The other is a very small pollution fee. And together, those two things fund what we call our Energy Community Reinvestment Fund, which supports just transitions for Marissa, where Prairie State is located, and all other coal reliant communities in the state. So for the workers, that would include pension protections. It would include healthcare for a period of time. It would include retraining for new jobs in clean energy or not in clean energy. They can go get a degree from an Illinois public university or community college at no cost to them, so they can move on to the next phase of their career. It would support property tax replacement. for up to 5 years in any community where a coal plant shuts down. And some of these fees would be levied on Prairie State, but the majority of it would be paid by large out-of-state companies, primarily out-of-state companies that operate other fossil fuel plants in Illinois. And we think that's mostly going to be taking a bite out of their profits. So as much as possible, we've tried to do right by the communities and have the people foot the bill be the polluters who have profited for decades from these plants. And too often, as we know, left communities, workers, and Illinois' health high and dry. So I hope that's helpful on that question.
Thanks, JC. I see a question in the chat. Isn't there a way to make the corporations extracting the coal to take financial responsibility for this mess?
Thanks, Sally. That was what I was sort of trying to speak to the last question. So in terms of the companies that are extracting coal, they would be subject to that coal severance fee. And the revenues from that coal severance fee would be used to support just transition and workforce training in Illinois. It's also worth noting that the vast majority of coal that is extracted in Illinois actually is not burned in Illinois. Much of it is shipped overseas because the quality of coal we have here is quite low, even by the standards of coal. So that's mostly for export.
I've got another question that probably will be for JC as well. Sorry to put on the spot so much. But we heard from Jean and Highland and Stephen and Cairo that their participation with IMEA limits their ability to go solar. So I have a question from somebody from the city of Rantoul that's experiencing the same thing. Rantoul has released ordinances that suppress residential and community solar. So homeowners aren't being compensated through net metering, like we heard happening in Cairo with the taco shop. So this individual wonders how CEJA will ensure full net metering in territories like IMEA that are exempt from most state power regs. So what does CEJA mean for those types of issues?
Sure, thanks, Amanda. So CEJA has a sort of a bill of rights for people to generate their own power, to put their own solar panels on their roof if that's what they want to do. We have seen entities who have a vested interest in fossil fuels, some of them like what we see here, but others like investor-owned utilities. This is sort of a classic play to try to shut out, increasingly economic solar from the market when they're for whatever reason deeply invested in continuing to use coal. So in this case, what we've heard from some of those communities that have regulations like this as well, we've agreed to buy all this expensive coal power from Prairie State. And you see, if you start generating your own solar power, then you can't help us pay for the coal power that we invested in. So, we end up with solar power that we don't need because we're buying all this coal power. So I think our view and what we hope that CEJA can do is by closing down the coal plant, that sort of excuse that, hey, we already have all the power we need from the most polluting source of energy, ever invented, that sort of goes away, and it creates more room not only for the utilities to buy wind and solar, but also for the people who live in those communities to generate their own solar. So we protect your rights to generate solar, and we get out of the way that coal generation that is sort of like blocking your path from doing that.
I would also like to suggest that maybe he has a complaint with his city government, because I have solar panels and Highland is pretty friendly. We do have net metering. There are different experiences all over the state. So you kind of have to maybe gather some information and see what you can accomplish.
So are we, do we want to answer some more questions here, or are we at time? Are we slated to go to 8:30?
We were slated for 8:30, yeah. So I think there's still plenty of questions, and as long as folks are down to stay and listen and keep asking, I think we can keep rolling.
All
Great.
right. We have a question, and I hope this hasn't already been answered. Does CEJA support a new union-sponsored push for green energy? Said the future of Illinois, okay. A new union-sponsored push for green energy said the future of Illinois' nuclear power plants is a priority.
I think I can field that, Sally, and sorry to everybody that you have to keep hearing me talking. I would say, Gary, that there are a lot of areas of shared interest between the Clean Jobs Coalition and the bill that you're referring to that is from Climate Jobs Illinois. I think there's a shared interest in a robust just transition program. I think there's a shared interest in significantly expanding the amount of renewable energy that we generate here in Illinois, to electrifying our transportation sector, which we know is also a really important piece of the puzzle. I think there are some things in CEJA that we don't see in that bill. Like CEJA moves us towards a 100% renewable energy economy. We think that that's really important. You know, CEJA has polluters pay for the just transition. We think that's really important. It has energy efficiency measures that are going to save customers $700 million on their bill. We think that's really important. And it has provisions to ensure that environmental justice communities and that Black and brown people who have too long suffered the worst impacts of the fossil fuel economy, but haven't often been able to reap the benefits of our energy system, that they are prioritized for clean air and for economic opportunity. So I think there's a lot of common ground with this proposal from the union. You know, I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration there. It's not 100% aligned, but I feel really optimistic about where we are.
Thank you. So this might be for JC as well. So while Illinois needs to avoid blackouts like in Texas recently, is coal required to be the fuel at Prairie State? Why not build cheaper methane burners to power the steam boiler or small modular reactors, which should be available in 5 to 8 years?
Right. So I guess a couple things here. First, it's funny that what went wrong in Texas, sort of first and foremost, was actually that their natural gas, I hate to use the word natural, that their gas plants failed. Like half of the gas generation in the state failed. Everything took a little bit of a dip, and there's a few reasons for that. Part of it is because Texas has not really winterized its energy system. They just weren't prepared for a storm like the one that they got. So their power lines, you know, weren't set up to withstand cold weather. You know, a lot of their gas plants actually just hadn't filed the paperwork that they were supposed to file to be prioritized to continue operating during an outage. They also don't do a great job of grid planning in Texas. They have next to no grid planning process in place. That is one of the things that we do in the Clean Energy Jobs Act, is we create a more robust, comprehensive and transparent process to plan our electric grid here in Illinois. But I think one of really the biggest things that happened there is that, you know, Texas is the Lone Star state, and going it alone is certainly the approach that they take when it comes to their electric grid. They have almost no interconnection with the electric grids around them. So if there is a problem that happens in Texas, you know, the same way that you might borrow a cup of sugar from your neighbor, if you have an interconnected electric grid, you can borrow some electricity from your neighbor. And so you see in the electric grids all around Texas, there was all this excess electricity that literally couldn't get to where it needed to go because they hadn't built out the electric transmission infrastructure that we think a healthy, affordable, and resilient electric grid should have. So Illinois is fortunate that we do have better transmission infrastructure. We're more interconnected with our neighboring grids than Texas is. In the Clean Energy Jobs Act, one of the things we want to do is build out even more transmission infrastructure, which we think will improve that resiliency. And energy efficiency and demand response can help a lot with this too. So I'd just say when we look at the lessons from Texas and how you sort of avoid that, I think it's by having a robust grid planning process, making sure that your grid is resilient and winterized, which ours largely is here in Illinois because we get cold weather all the time, investing in energy efficiency and demand response, and having robust transmission connections. But fossil fuels would not have saved them. And in fact, it's fossil fuels that sunk them. So I hope we learn the right lessons from Texas and we try to incorporate a lot of those ideas in the Clean Energy Jobs Act.
Yeah, and I can add a little bit to that. When we're talking about building more at Prairie State, right? We have to ask who's paying for that. You know, even if a cheaper methane, or if a methane burner or anything else costs $0, right? We have to remember that Prairie State is still uneconomic, and so adding more to that site is likely not in our best interest.
And sorry, if I could just add one more thing there, Ashton. For instance, we know that, you know, the idea of doing a carbon capture and storage project has been floated at Prairie State. Carbon capture and storage takes a tremendous amount of energy to do. In some cases, plants that are running carbon capture and storage operations had to open another smaller power plant on the site just to power the carbon and capture operation. And so however you slice it, it ends up making the plant less efficient. It takes more energy to run. And as we saw from Kevin, it's already pretty inefficient. And that just means more costly. So it's not that those options are impossible. They're technically possible. But if you look at what is the cheapest way going to be to get clean, reliable energy, the analysis shows that that is a clean energy, a clean portfolio standard like the one that Kevin laid out in the RMI report.
Thank you, JC. This is a different kind of question. I think it probably speaks to the attitude that Prairie State has toward local communities. Did Prairie State ever complete the analysis of pollutants carried in their emergency overflow into an unnamed tributary of Mud Creek? Originally, this discharge was permitted without analysis of the discharge waters, since mine was not fully open and holding ponds had not been built. Anyone able to tackle that one?
That might be one we need to follow up on. I feel like that, like a discharge into a specific body of water is a pretty niche question. So clearly we have a very informed audience here. So maybe whoever asked that could share their contact information with one of us.
Union of Concerned Scientists member, and I can definitely follow up. Thank you so much.
From that same person, and this may also need follow-up, are they still developing a second mine entrance near Highway 460 and 15 and City Highway 12? Does anybody have information about that, or do we need to follow up on that as well? Follow up? Okay.
I think that might be another follow-up.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I think we've all heard this question before, and this person's anticipating criticism from their local village council. So what replaces the base generation of Prairie State on cloudy days or at night? So the sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow.
You know, Kevin, I thought you had a really thoughtful answer the other day about the idea of baseload in general. Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I can address this in part, and then I think JC could get back to you to some how this interfaces with CEJA. So, you know, I think, you know, to JC's first point, traditionally I mean, as of like 10 years ago, we often talked about baseload, and that baseload was critical to this energy system. That, you know, I think this was part of how it was sold, that Prairie State represents this base load. Well, as the energy systems evolved and the technologies evolved, that's become a bit of an antiquated concept. What we need is the energy and the power to match the load that we need at every time. So there's this matching exercise, and it can be done through a variety of technologies. Wind and solar are great because increasingly they're kind of the workhorses that can provide low cost energy when we need them. Increasingly, we're getting technologies like battery storage that can help balance things out and provide quick responsive energy and help extend the time where solar is available. So those are some really great, valuable technologies. I'd add a couple other additional members of the team that we model and then sort of get to the question, because they don't all necessarily totally get there. I think other parts is energy efficiency is always critical. If Texas had decided to invest in energy efficiency, we would have seen a lot of the issues avoided that we saw back in February, because there just wouldn't have been as much demand across the system. As we see more electric vehicles and more folks switch to high efficiency heat pumping heating, the opportunities for demand response to sort of flex load and when it occurs during the time is going to exist. Even with all that, our best modeling is starting to show there's some challenges. There's times, winter in particular, where you might have days where it's not very windy and it's not very sunny. There's a couple solutions emerging to address that. One, as JC mentioned, is expanding transmission networks. Though it might be cloudy and it might not be windy in Illinois, somewhere in the country, it's going to be windy and it's going to be sunny. So how can we expand our balancing pool across the country and use transmission to interconnect? So that'd be solution number one. Solution number two is continuing to rely on some of the resources that are in the community that are connected to the MISO and PJM network. As it stands, there's a lot of natural gas capacity in particular throughout the states. Now, CEJA is going to have some implications on the ability to generate from natural gas and other thermal resources in the state of Illinois, but fortunately, Illinois is well interconnected to other states. So I think as we look out to sort of the 2030s, a lot of the modeling that I've seen talking about our ability to shift to clean energy, we're going to have lots of wind, we're going to have lots of solar, we're going to have lots of battery storage, and that flexible demand and energy efficiency, like I mentioned. We're also, in most instances, going to continue to rely on that natural gas that's already in place to help fill the gaps and help carry us through those times where where renewable energy maybe isn't as productive. So I think that's sort of a broad answer. I realize you're probably looking for a pithy, shorter statement than that, but that's sort of like the way those dynamics work out. But JC, maybe can you just touch on that? I know you've looked a little bit into that and how that interfaces with some of the CEJA provisions.
Yeah, I would just say on the Prairie State plan specifically, and I think Kevin spoke to this a little bit in the beginning, but your municipal utility is not charged with maintaining the reliability of the electric grid. That is handled by what are called regional transmission organizations, or RTOs. And there are two in Illinois. In Northern Illinois, the RTO is called PJM. So the way that we protect reliability in PJM is through a mechanism called capacity, which is essentially paying power plants to be on call when they're needed. The way, like, if you've ever worked at a restaurant, right, you might be like on call for a shift if it gets busy and you have to get called in. Now, unlike the restaurant employees, these plants get paid for doing that. But we already have significantly more capacity than we need in Northern Illinois. And the other thing is that Prairie State is actually not even on the grid in Northern Illinois. So it's possible that it is importing some of that power, but in the bigger picture of like how much of the power in Northern Illinois is coming from Prairie State, it's very little. And so we do not expect that the closure would have any reliability impacts at all in Northern Illinois. In Southern Illinois, the RTO down there is MISO, which stands for Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. They're charged with keeping the electric grid reliable in Southern Illinois. Energy and capacity are not quite as prevalent in MISO as they are in Northern Illinois, because the nuclear generation in the state is largely located in the northern part of the state. But we still think that there is still a fair amount of other resources online in MISO. And in fact, we, NRDC, did a study a couple of years ago with a grid analyst that found that we could fully move away from coal in Southern Illinois by 2030 and do so actually at a lower cost to customers down there. So from a reliability perspective, we're pretty comfortable in both the northern and southern parts of the state that the closure of this plant is not going to have a major impact. So Gary asked in the chat if 100% renewable energy needs gas sometimes. Gary, I would say that we expect, so when CEJA moves to 100% renewable energy is in 2050, so 29 years from now. We anticipate huge breakthroughs are being made every day on battery storage technology, including like liquid batteries and a lot of other innovations. If you look at where we were 29 years ago, it is night and day. So we anticipate that with significant improvement in battery storage technology, with a better transmission grid, that we're going to be in good shape in 2050 on all that, because it's just a lot of time. So more immediately, we are fortunate here in Illinois that we can move away from fossil fuels more quickly without running into reliability issues because we have the largest nuclear generation fleet in the country. Obviously, we have our own concerns about nuclear generation, but if the alternative is coal, we think we got to move away from coal first. So hopefully that's helpful on that.
Great, thanks. And I just wanted to chime in as well on this question around, not specifically to Prairie State, but Illinois did, the Union of Concerned Scientists did do an analysis in 2018 on clean energy transition for a bunch of Illinois coal plants called Sit to Solar. I'll share that in the chat in a second. But essentially, we did reliability studies as well as case studies on what the communities are doing to replace the energy and replace jobs and kind of keep the tax base going. And we found that solar plus storage as a combination basically fulfills the generation needs for those plants, and that there were no reliability concerns in general, where basically we found in those plants you could just shut them off and there would be no threat to the grid as a whole, and no threats to power outages. So I'll share that in case you have folks who would be interested in reading about some of the other coal plants in Illinois, because I'm sure those lessons learned would be applicable to Prairie State as well.
Thanks, Megan. We have a question more on the federal end of things. Dick Durbin. Dick Durbin's position on Prairie State in his home turf, and it says his traditional power base is big coal, while Kemi Duckworth is big oil backed. Do we have any comments on that?
I would just say that this is a state issue. Whether Prairie State continues to operate or not, and how we manage our power grid is firmly within the purview of states. Federal law is pretty clear on that. And so, that is just not going to be a piece of legislation that is going to be in the chamber where Dick Durbin works. So I do think that there will be federal opportunities that may come up in the next couple of years to provide money for more investments in the clean energy economy. And I think our interpretation of that is that the states that show that they're already moving in that direction, that they are ready, are the ones that are going to get the lion's share of that. And if states show that they want to stick with coal and gas, that they, that they probably may not get as much of that investment. So I would hope that every elected official in Illinois would want good jobs and good health for the people, and we think that's what this does.
Thanks, JC.
All right, I've got a question. Will CEJA charge a carbon tax for importing power from out-of-state carbon resources? I
swear this is one of the most informed and thoughtful town hall audiences that I have ever been involved with. So whomever asked that question, that is actually the purview of the regional transmission organizations that I talked about. Because when we're talking about in-state power, the state is well within its rights, again, under the Clean Air Act and under its own taxing body to impose fees on generators inside its state limits. But when we're talking about out-of-state generators, now we're talking about interstate commerce. And when we're talking about interstate commerce, that's the purview of the federal government. So I know that there, in PJM in particular, I know that there have been some conversations about how the grid operator could implement or at least enable carbon taxation of some kind on its system. But that hasn't come to a head yet, and the state cannot do that on its own. It would have to be RTO involved.
Thank you, JC. Getting back to the legislative aspect of CEJA, do we happen to know the status of CEJA, how much support we have in the House and the Senate?
So glad you asked. I have the House right in front of me. It'll take me a second to get to the Senate, but first, maybe I can provide a bit of context on where things stand in the legislature. And I would let Senator Ellman do the honors here, except that we have lost her. CEJA has moved out of committee in the House. So it passed out of the House Energy and Environment Committee a couple of weeks ago on quite a strong vote, I think 18-11 or something like that. So it is now on the floor of the House on what is called second reading. And so when bills move through the Illinois legislature, first they are in committee, then they go on the floor into second reading, and then they have to go to third reading, and then finally they pass out of the respective chamber. So we're on second reading right now. A lot of energy bills are being held on second reading. A lot of energy bill sponsors have agreed to hold them at that point to facilitate conversations around a broader energy package. CEJA, to my knowledge, is the only energy bill where we sort of haven't been held to not moving it off of second reading. So this is a little wonky here, but what that means is that the more grassroots pressure we can create, the more our legislators can hear from us that we want CEJA, we want to move it. We actually have a path forward to do that, at least in the House, which is something that a lot of the other bills, most of which are essentially sponsored by corporations, do not have an opportunity to do. So in the Senate, we have not yet moved out of committee. They've been working their way through the different energy bills in the Senate Energy Committee. We actually have a subject matter hearing on CEJA in the Senate committee tomorrow morning. And so maybe somebody can grab a link and put that in the chat, because one of the things that I know a lot of folks are doing right now is filing witness slips in support of the Clean Energy Jobs Act ahead of that Senate hearing tomorrow. So the Senate bill is SB 1718, and we're going to get a link in the chat in just one moment so that you can get on the Senate website and actually file a witness slip in support of CEJA. So we look forward to moving it out of committee in the Senate very soon, getting to the same place we are in the House so we can start moving forward. And folks on this call can help us do that by filing a witness slip.
You, JC. You kind of answered my last question, which was what can folks do? So we're at 8:30. I'm going to just give all the panelists one more chance if any of them want to say anything while we get that link in the chat for you.
The link doesn't seem to be working right now, but I will paste it anyhow.
And I know that somebody asked how many sponsors we had in each house. So we have 15 sponsors in the Senate right now. And we have 44 sponsors in the House. So we actually have a bunch of Senate sponsors who did sponsor the bill last time. And I think just because things have been crazy with the legislature being remote and everything, maybe haven't gotten around to re-signing up as co-sponsors. So worth checking that list of sponsors, seeing if your legislator is on there. And if they're not, give them a call and ask them to sponsor CEJA.
Any other panelists want to say anything? Great. Well, thank you all. We have your email addresses from when you registered for this Zoom presentation. So we will send a follow-up email with the link to the recording. And again, you can find it on United Congregations of Metro East Facebook page. Pastor Kevin James, who spoke with us, is the Vice President of the UCM board. I'd encourage you to look into the reports we shared, to the community organizations that you heard from, like UCM, Men of Power, Women of Strength, and talk to folks in your community about Prairie State and take some of the actions JC said. So with that, I think we'll close out tonight, and I appreciate all you panelists and all the participants. Thank you.